The World Economic Forum in Davos wrapped up yesterday as business leaders and members of civil society all came together to discuss matters relating to the global shift and economic dynamics. The focus was on geopolitical risks and the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine. Now, the recent developments in Gaza and US former President Donald Trump's re-election bid. On this continent, the Africa Free Trade Agreement will expand its bloc to 31 more countries to test Pan-African payment and settlement systems this year. Let's unpack the takeaways of the proceedings and how these developments impact the African continent with University of Limpopo's Communications Director Victor Kgomoeswana joining us in studio. A very good morning to you. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika.
Good to see you again in the new year, Mpo.
Yes.
Beautiful studio as always.
Thank you so much for coming through. I mean, some pressing issues were discussed there.
Yeah.
Really looking at the impact. It's almost like a ripple effect on each country and the continent at large. What stood out for you as, you know, the issues were being broken down at that conference?
It's exactly what you started with, Mpo. The fact that the African Continental Free Trade Area seems to be gaining momentum. And I know it's slow. I'll be the first to admit we should have had intra-Africa trade long ago. For context, we're still below 20%. In other words, of all the exports from all African countries, only 20% or less will be going to other African countries. And in fact, yesterday I spoke about a story of Nigerian non-oil exports dropping from about $4.18 billion to about 4.15. Now, that's a minor drop, but if it's non-oil, it's because the countries to which Nigeria is exporting, like Mali, Niger, and those African countries, were not stable enough to be able to receive some of the exports. That was the reason. And that's an important thing. So, African Continental Free Trade Area is a major framework within which we can do this. You'll recall it was adopted and came into effect in 2020, but unfortunately COVID didn't make things easier for us because then it locked down everything. But last year, this is 2023, the Secretariat took about 7 countries out of those 47 that had ratified this and took them on what they call a guided trade initiative. That means enforcing or enabling those 7 countries to prepare their authorities, their customs authorities, their tax authorities, their border post control, and all the systems or institutions within that country to be able to facilitate trade. Because it's one thing to say, let's trade with one another, but it's another to be able to do it. When you get to border posts, you have to stop twice. When you go to non-trade barriers, as we call them, get into a weigh bridge here and all that. The guided trade initiative was to help those countries to remove those barriers so that trade can be done. And it's estimated that at least there was a 20% removal of at least 20% of the customs in there. That means when you are an African trader, small business, now you already have a 20% competitiveness edge over other people who are not exporting to those countries from Africa.
Yeah.
Now they have expanded that to 31 countries. What does that mean? It means now there will be 31 countries, if you like, that will be receiving assistance, not financial assistance necessarily, but assistance, the support that will say, let's look at your revenue authority to be able to collect the right kind of customs or remove those duties that have to be removed but not lose by getting law enforcement, by making sure that your border posts are efficient. That is a major step because if you get 31 countries out of even those that haven't ratified, it's 31 out of 55. We are way over 50% of the countries that will be participating in this. And the beauty of this guided initiative now is including the inter-country payment system. If you're selling from South Africa in Rand and you're selling to somebody in Nigeria in Naira, it used to be difficult to process payment using the interbank transfer systems because they would say, do you want dollars? And therefore our trade as Africans would depend on the strength of the dollar instead of just paying somebody in your local currency and they receive that payment in their country in their local currency. Yeah. This is a major step, and big up to the Secretary General, Wamkele Mene, for using this Davos Forum to tell the rulers of the world, influential people, the rich multinationals, that Africa is open for business, but we are now instituting systems to make it possible.
In fact, the World Bank is forecasting that accord will increase trade within the region by 80% to $532 billion by the year 2035. So,
and that's the idea. Because remember, let's give the numbers. Africa has over 1 billion people now. So if you have been trying to sell to the US, 300 million people, to Europe, to Russia, to China, leaving a market of over 1 billion people, it doesn't matter what you're selling, whether it's this bottle, whether it's a banana, whether it's an avocado. If you are getting a market that big with duties removed, we're talking trillions and trillions of dollars. That's why they say this African Continental Free Trade Area, when it's really functioning, will be the largest free trade area in the world.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. Yeah. As you spoke about the economy, what stood out for me was Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo telling the forum that the world economy is structured to benefit wealthy nations. That in itself needs to change.
What's new? What's new? The World Economic Forum, let's remind those who don't know, was founded to extend the influence of America over Europe. That's what Professor Klaus Schwab, the German professor of economics, was doing. When he called the meeting in 1971 for the first time, it was to teach Europeans American ways of management and leadership. And the context is that's when the world was learning to repair itself after World War II, and America was stamping its authority as a superpower. Why do I give this context? It's because the 1,000 or so member corporations that are there, these are multi-billion-dollar corporations. They are the rich club of the world. And so WEF was never and is never going to be about poor nations. The only thing you can do when you are invited to that forum is to make sure you know who is there, you make sure you know what they want out of your country or your company, so that you can tell them what they want to hear to enable trade with them to go up to your benefit. You either go to WEF in Davos with your own agenda, or you'll remain somebody else's pawn.
Yeah, and that's quite important, especially because it compromises the willingness for win-win scenarios, should that plan not be in place.
And here's the reason I don't like to hear an African president complain in Davos. How do you go to a rich man's house and you get there and you start cursing at the rich? You can't curse at the rich. You don't go to their house if you don't like the way they are structured in the system. And here's the weakness of African leadership. Instead of going there as the African Union, they still go as individual member countries. And then they complain. Well, one of the things that weakens African leaders is that they go there as individuals. They take their own delegations and they try and punt this small country. What is to punt about Ghana right now? I love Ghana, by the way. It's one of my favorite countries on the whole African continent.
Yeah.
But it is heavily indebted. Even as we speak, it's talking about getting an extra loan from IMF to balance its books. The same with Kenya. These are great countries, these are great economies with great people. But to go to Davos just so that you can affirm that you have got extra $500 million in debt from the IMF, I don't think it's what you need to go to IMF for. To the World Economic Forum for. You can do that right here on the African continent. But I suspect until the African Union member countries learn to go to Davos as a bloc with one voice, with a smaller delegation, we will continue to be somebody else's pawn. We will continue to play somebody else's game.
So with the geopolitical problems at hand, what will it take for the African leaders to perhaps rethink the continent's place in the global community as they come together and speak in one voice to really push their agenda?
Well, again, we must know our history. The borders of Africa as we know them, as we enforce them, and sometimes in the most brutal ways, because Africans can attack one another in the most brutal ways. These borders were drawn by European and other superpowers in 1884 and 1885 at the Berlin conference. Again, the purpose of drawing up these borders was to divide Africa among the powerful nations so that they, the powerful nations, could continue to exploit the resources in the African countries. Therefore, when we go to a forum like WEF, we must remember that history and know that, yes, we might respect the sovereignty of the African states. But if we say we are one African Union, and if we say we have now embraced the African Continental Free Trade Area because we acknowledge how powerful we are economically when we operate as one bloc, then we can't continue to go there. It's about an awareness that's translated into action. In fact, I'm disappointed because more than about a year ago, when President William Ruto was elected, he said something very encouraging. He said, we will no longer, as African leaders, go to Europe, go to FOCAC, go to JICA in Japan, or go to America as individual. We will get a delegation. I thought, what a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
Guess what? I'm hearing about Kenya now getting an extra $600 million in disbursement for the loan. That's just... And they're still talking as individuals. They're having stands that are there at Davos. And this is an expensive way to market yourself, especially if you're continuing the divisions that you know from your history were never intended to make you stronger, but to make you weaker.
So some of the other hot topics, you know, and perhaps the draw card here should be how African countries, African leaders were awoken to new realities with the hot topics like the impact of COVID-19, the Ukraine war, Gaza. How does that now speak to the African voice? I mean, South Africa, for one, going to the ICJ, that in itself, you know, speaks volumes. Yes,
South Africa goes to the International Court of Justice. Brilliant move. It's a good show of solidarity with humanity, especially the weak and the vulnerable. That's a great thing. But hang on a second. Millions of Africans perish, or hundreds of thousands, risk perishing in the Mediterranean Sea, escaping poverty and poor governance on the African continent to try and make a living in Europe. You look at the Italian soccer team, just for an illustration, or the French soccer team. You see the Spanish soccer team, the star of the World Cup of women's soccer was a girl who is called Spanish, but she's actually African. Yeah. Her parents had to leave in search of a better life. What I'm saying is, you cannot choose which battles you pick on the world stage. You should agree, I'm for humanity, I'm from the weak and vulnerable, starting with the weak and vulnerable in your own backyard. And if there are so many African countries that are sleeping in houses that are not well sanitized, that are not well, and they are driving on potholed roads, and they are having water that's poisoning them, and they don't have enough electricity to keep warm, and they don't have education that prepares them for the world of war, then you can't just suddenly stand up and be very outspoken on human rights when you are violating human rights in your own continent. And again, I'm not talking about Gaza not being a priority. It is a priority. But I'm saying if it's that big a priority because we understand the welfare of people of Gaza matters, we should show it even more aggressively when we are back home by ensuring that we give people access to good education, education that prepares them for the real world of work. We give them solid health care. We give them proper means to earn an income so that we fight that triple devil called poverty, ignorance, and disease. You can't preside over a system that continues to leave your people poor, ignorant, and unhealthy, and you say you want to be a champion of the rest of the world. It's not believable. It looks like you're putting on a show to those who are sitting at home, perishing under an ineffective system that you are in charge of.
Putting on a show, but to what benefit? I mean, why?
I've got no way of knowing. I'm not a politician. I'm not a big businessman. And these guys have their own music. Again, let me emphasize, I'm all for Gaza and the people of Palestine getting their rights and respected because that's an apartheid system that's keeping them outside. But I'm saying to you, if you care about humanity in Gaza and the Middle East, for goodness sake, show me that you care about the kids who don't have a toilet in rural Limpopo, when they go to school every day and they are falling into those pit toilets, make sure that you are as outspoken and as aggressive and as expedient in how you address it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us about these pressing matters. That was the University of Limpopo's Communications Director, Victor Kgomoeswana, speaking to us there about the World Economic Forum concluding, wrapping up, and, of course, the impact on the African continent.